Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to a time when Europe finally stopped coughing, just long enough to look around and wonder, what now? The Black Death had ended, or at least, it had slowed down enough for people to start counting who was still alive. It wasn't a short story. It lasted years, creeping in waves, from one bewildered town to the next. But when the worst was over, somewhere around the early 1350s, Europe didn't so much recover as it sagged. Like a house that had survived a fire, technically standing, but not entirely sure why. Half the population was gone. In some places, even more. Whole villages had simply vanished, replaced by silence and overgrown weeds. And for those who remained, the new world felt oddly empty and eerily quiet. It's hard to overstate how strange that must have been. You could walk for miles and not see another person. In towns, the houses stood locked and dusty, with tools still lying where someone had dropped them mid-task, and bread loaves turned to stone on cold hearths. People who survived didn't talk much about it. They didn't have the language for what had happened. The church tried, of course they did, but their explanations didn't land quite as firmly as before. After all, if the priests were supposed to be God's representatives on earth, and half of them had died just as miserably as everyone else, people started to suspect maybe God wasn't taking requests anymore. So, society began to shift. Gently, awkwardly, like someone learning to walk again after a very bad fall. Labor was suddenly valuable. Peasants, who used to be little more than breathing equipment for fields, realized they could ask for better pay. And when their lords refused, they sometimes just left. In England, this slow rebellion simmered quietly for years before exploding into something called the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. But before that happened, there was a strange few decades when the survivors tried to rebuild life, often with the kind of decisions that made future historians sigh in appreciation. For instance, towns that had lost their populations tried to lure people back by offering land, animals, or, occasionally, tax breaks. You'd think that would work. But many survivors preferred to move somewhere new entirely, where no one remembered them coughing last winter. Entire regions shifted like tides, laborers moving north, families vanishing south, all in slow motion. And the economy? Well, let's just say medieval bookkeeping was never Europe's strongest suit. Kings tried to regulate prices, wages, and even clothing, because of course they did. England's Edward III, who was having a hard time accepting that he might need peasants more than peasants needed him, passed laws to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. This went about as well as you'd expect. People ignored the law, and lords found themselves offering under-the-table deals just to harvest their fields. Laborers became choosy. Some even started dressing better, because they could now afford cloth that wasn't woven out of leftover despair. And that didn't go unnoticed. There was something deeply offensive, to the upper classes, about a farmhand showing up to work wearing fur trim. They wrote moral complaints about it, long ones, which is always a sign of deep societal panic. Let's drift, gently, into the irony of all this. For centuries, the Church had preached humility. But the survivors of the Black Death weren't humble anymore. They'd watched half their friends die. They'd stopped believing in cosmic fairness. So they indulged in small, defiant acts of living. Drinking, gambling, wearing bright colors, all terribly sinful, and all suddenly very popular. The plague had created a world without enough people to maintain old hierarchies. And that scared those at the top. Nobles found themselves without servants. Land went unworked. Taxes vanished like smoke. For monarchs used to endless wars and banquet budgets, this was alarming. In France, King John II tried to rebuild his treasury by raising taxes on an already battered population. He also managed to get captured by the English in battle, which, to be fair, was very on brand for the period. By the time his son, Charles V, took over, France had been chewed apart by war, plague, and financial idiocy. Yet people still found ways to build small luxuries into their days, a nicer cloak, a bit of music, something to remind them they were alive. You can almost picture it, thin-faced survivors sitting in half-empty taverns, clinking mugs in defiance of the world's collapse. Because what else could they do? What would you have done, I wonder? Gone back to the fields, or found something new? Tell me in the comments. When the world collapses, do you rebuild it, or just start walking the other direction? Let's drift onward. Europe's recovery from the Black Death wasn't fast. It was uneven, patchy, and mostly guided by bad guesses. People didn't understand germs or sanitation, but they did understand guilt. So they spent a lot of time feeling it. The clergy encouraged everyone to repent harder, as though the plague had been caused by insufficient kneeling. Flagellants, groups of people who traveled around whipping themselves for God's attention, became oddly popular. Imagine running into a crowd of shirtless penitents rhythmically smacking themselves with leather straps in the middle of your grocery trip, and you've got the mood. But here's the odd thing. The plague had killed so many church officials that the quality of replacements declined. Many were barely literate. Some were just wealthy locals buying church positions. So while sermons thundered about sin, actual faith began to thin out. The church was, in a word, rattled. It had always claimed divine authority, but the plague had made it look fragile, and fragility isn't great branding for an institution built on eternity. So new spiritual movements emerged, half mystical, half desperate. People looked for meaning in astrology, relics, even early alchemy. Art, too, changed. Before the plague, religious paintings were full of serene saints and hopeful symbolism. Afterward, Europe discovered skulls. Skeletons appeared everywhere, dancing, marching, grinning. Artists painted the danse macabre, the dance of death, to remind everyone that life was short, messy, and increasingly ironic. Meanwhile, the nobles had their own problems. Many had lost heirs, spouses, or whole family branches. Inbreeding, already a casual tradition, now became logistical necessity. Some dynasties simply recycled cousins like family furniture. You might think tragedy would inspire better leadership. It didn't. In fact, it seemed to make royals even more indecisive. The English kings, for example, spent years arguing with Parliament over taxes to fund wars they couldn't really afford. The 100 Years' War, which was, technically, still going on, turned into the medieval version of a subscription you forgot to cancel. And down among the peasants, the world was slowly transforming. Laborers discovered mobility. They could move to towns, learn trades, even buy land. This terrified landowners, who still clung to the idea that God had personally assigned everyone their social rank at birth. So governments did what governments often do when they panic. They tried to legislate the past back into existence. Wage freezes, clothing bans, moral decrees, anything to stop the social order from wobbling. But it kept wobbling anyway. The strange thing about the Black Death's aftermath is that it gave birth to something like early capitalism. Fewer workers meant higher demand, which meant better pay, which meant a slowly emerging middle class. Not that anyone called it that yet. To medieval minds, a middle class was basically heresy, the idea that someone could exist between rich and poor without divine permission. And so tension simmered. The world was changing faster than anyone could explain, and explanations back then tended to involve saints, devils, or bad smells. The elites, of course, didn't change much. They still threw lavish feasts, even when half their guests were missing. Food was symbolic. More was always better. Dishes became absurdly elaborate. Entire peacocks roasted, then redressed in their feathers, as if pretending they weren't dead. It was spectacle, a kind of denial served on silver platters. Let's pause there. Just imagine the echoing halls, the flicker of candlelight on gilded plates, and the faint sense that maybe everyone was still pretending the world hadn't ended. The people outside those halls weren't pretending. They were different now. Stronger, sometimes meaner, but undeniably more aware of how fragile everything was. I wonder, if you lived in that time, would you have stayed faithful or quietly started doubting? Leave a sleepy thought in the comments if you're still awake. Let's drift onward. By the late 14th century, Europe had grown used to being haunted. The plague returned in smaller waves, like an unwelcome relative who doesn't understand hints. But each return was a little weaker, and life went on, or at least stumbled forward. Cities began rebuilding. Merchants grew rich off trade. Guilds expanded, forming the roots of early modern economies. It wasn't glamorous, but it was progress. But beneath it all, there was something new, awareness. Ordinary people started realizing that the world could change, drastically, horribly, suddenly. And once you know that, you can't unknow it. Feudalism, that rigid pyramid of who owned whom, began to erode. Slowly, unevenly, but unmistakably. Kings wanted to think they still ran things, but increasingly, money did. Land was valuable, yes, but so were coins, especially to people who'd survived on barter for centuries. And so Europe shifted, inch by inch, toward something more modern. There was still war, famine, and stupidity, naturally. But the tone had changed. People had seen death on a scale that made everyday fear seem almost manageable. The peasants of England rose up in rebellion in 1381, tired of endless taxes and tone-deaf monarchs. They didn't succeed long-term, but their anger lingered, echoing across generations. In France, cities like Paris began to assert independence, challenging royal authority. The concept of the people was beginning to form, quietly, in the background, like a seed under frost. Of course, The elites didn't notice. They were too busy arguing about etiquette. There's something comforting, I think, about how little changes. When in doubt, the upper classes always focus on dress codes. But the plague had done something irreversible. It had democratized survival. Everyone left alive was, in a sense, equal before mortality. Let's drift to the heart of that idea. What happens when you realize the world doesn't owe you meaning? Europe, post-plague, was both broken and awake. And that tension would eventually give rise to the Renaissance. But that's a story for a later night. For now, if you've made it this far, tell me, what would you have rebuilt first if half your world disappeared? By the mid-1300s, Europe had developed an odd kind of confidence, the sort that usually appears when people mistake exhaustion for wisdom. Everyone was alive, and that alone felt like a qualification to advise others. Priests lectured more sternly, merchants quoted scripture to justify overcharging, and nobles claimed divine favor for surviving what most of their subjects hadn't. And yet, beneath all the speeches, there was a faint whiff of uncertainty. The plague had chewed holes in everything. Family trees, social structures, the church's authority, even the economy. What passed for normal life was more like a patchwork quilt, stitched from whatever scraps remained. Take England, for instance. King Edward III had spent the earlier years of his reign trying to look heroic in France. Now, with half the workforce gone, he turned his attention homeward, which for any medieval monarch was always a mistake. His government passed something called the Statute of Laborers, a long document essentially saying, "Stop asking for higher wages. You should be grateful to be breathing." The law was ignored immediately, which everyone could have predicted except, apparently, the king. Sheriffs were supposed to enforce it, but sheriffs were often landowners themselves, equally desperate for workers. So they quietly turned a blind eye, while pretending in official letters that everything was under control. Meanwhile, on the continent, Venice was doing what Venice always did, making money. It had suffered terribly during the plague, but it recovered faster than most because it controlled trade routes. Venetian merchants began selling luxury goods to people who wanted proof they'd survived. You could tell who'd made it through the plague by the amount of silk they wore, which was perhaps not the most tasteful memorial. And then there was the matter of medicine. Doctors hadn't learned much from the experience, except that beak masks looked authoritative. They still believed diseases came from bad air or miasma, which was technically wrong but poetically satisfying. Cities introduced new regulations about waste disposal and street cleaning, not because they understood hygiene, but because they were tired of the smell. The new obsession with cleanliness had an unintended side effect. Perfume became fashionable. Nobles bathed infrequently but drenched themselves in rosewater. One chronicler noted that a fashionable court smelled like a garden over a sewer, which feels both accurate and uncomfortably vivid. Society's hierarchy also began to tilt. Guilds, once exclusive clubs of artisans, opened their doors to newcomers because they needed members. Former peasants became apprentices, learned trades, and started small businesses. It was the quiet birth of a middle class, though no one dared call it that yet. You might think kings would celebrate this new productivity. They didn't. They saw it as disorder, the worst kind of sin. Anything that looked like change was automatically labeled rebellion. Still, change seeped through everything, as inevitable as damp in castle walls. The arts mirrored the shift. Writers began exploring realism instead of perfect piety. In Italy, Boccaccio wrote the Decameron, a collection of stories told by 10 young people hiding from the plague in a country villa. It was witty, sometimes indecent, and defiantly alive. The book spread quietly across Europe, whispering that laughter was allowed again. And somewhere between that laughter and the cautious rebuilding, Europe found its first fragile balance. I wonder, if you'd lived then, would you have gone back to church for comfort, or tried your luck in Venice selling silk? Let me know down below, when you're awake enough to type. Let's drift onward. The early 1400s arrived looking suspiciously like the 1300s with worse haircuts. Europe was still trying to convince itself the plague was over, though small outbreaks continued to appear like bad memories. Each new flare-up caused panic, quarantines, and frantic prayers, but people now responded with weary efficiency, like commuters reacting to yet another train delay. Governments tried to appear proactive. Venice established quarantine islands, where ships waited 40 days before unloading. The word quarantine itself came from quaranta giorni, 40 days. Other ports copied the idea, though in some places the waiting period depended more on local impatience than medical insight. Elsewhere, moralists claimed the plague had been divine punishment for human vanity. Europe responded by becoming more vain. Fashion grew elaborate. Pointed shoes reached absurd lengths, and laws were passed to limit how far they could extend beyond the foot. Apparently, in England, the legal maximum was 2 inches for commoners, 24 for nobles. No one enforced it, naturally. The plague also left a kind of survivor's guilt that expressed itself through architecture. Cathedrals, half-finished when the plague struck, were finally completed, larger, grander, and more ostentatious than before. It was as if builders wanted to prove that humanity could still create beauty out of rot. And perhaps they needed distraction. The old social order continued to crumble quietly. Landowners rented out fields instead of demanding labor. Peasants began saving money, a novelty so alarming that theologians debated whether hoarding coins was sinful. This slow shift in wealth also created new tensions. In towns, rich merchants started behaving like nobility, building grand houses and marrying their children upward. True nobles looked down on them but borrowed money from them anyway. Europe was turning into a continent of debtors, a trend that, let's be honest, never really stopped. Across the Channel, the English monarchy was doing what it did best, collapsing under its own paperwork. The later Plantagenets managed to turn every domestic problem into a family feud. Henry IV seized the throne from his cousin Richard II. His son Henry V went back to fighting the French, because apparently no one in England had new ideas. Wars were expensive, but the economy was fragile, so taxes kept rising. Ordinary people, still haunted by memories of the plague, started wondering why they had to die in battles too. It was an inconvenient question for monarchs who preferred their subjects uncurious. Culturally, though, things were stirring. The printing press was on the horizon. Universities expanded. Scholars rediscovered old Greek and Roman texts that had survived in dusty monastery libraries. Europe was preparing, without quite knowing it, for the Renaissance, though most people were still too busy staying alive to notice. Meanwhile, at the dinner tables of the elite, conversation turned to destiny, fortune, and occasionally digestion. Chroniclers wrote about banquets where guests discussed the meaning of life between courses of swan pie. It was philosophy with gravy. The church remained powerful but defensive. Popes argued with rival popes in what became known as the Great Schism, a period when there were two, sometimes three, claimants to the papal throne. Europe politely ignored whichever pope wasn't local. It was bureaucratic chaos at its most theological. The irony was rich. While peasants experimented with new freedoms, the institution claiming moral authority couldn't even agree on who was in charge. You can almost sense the exhaustion running through the century, like everyone was pretending to be fine while quietly wondering if they were next. What do you think you'd have done in that long aftermath? Worked harder to rebuild, or given up and joined a monastery for the peace and free bread? Let's drift onward. By the middle of the 15th century, Europe had learned to live with death, not in fear, but as background noise. Cemeteries were part of daily scenery, yet life seemed determined to grow around them. Markets bustled again. Towns sprouted new guild halls and clock towers. People developed an almost reckless enthusiasm for progress. Painters experimented with perspective. Scientists quietly doubted Aristotle. Bankers invented accounting. Civilization, against the odds, was reorganizing itself. But not everyone was pleased. Old families resented the rise of merchants. Priests complained that people cared more about profit than prayer. Moralists insisted the world was decaying, though it had arguably been doing that since creation. In Florence, the Medici family demonstrated how much power money could buy. They sponsored artists, manipulated politics, and subtly reminded everyone that piety was easier when you could afford cathedrals. The Medici weren't nobles in the old sense, but wealth gave them something far more effective: influence. Meanwhile, across Europe, monarchies kept adjusting to the new reality. Royal courts became centers of display rather than warfare. Pageantry replaced crusading. Kings measured prestige in tapestries instead of territories. It was progress of a sort, bloodless, if occasionally ridiculous. Still, the memory of the Black Death lingered. Every few years, rumors of new outbreaks sent people into panic. They burned incense, rang church bells, and prayed to saints whose job descriptions now included plague prevention. Medicine, though still primitive, was beginning to evolve. Some doctors started keeping notes, comparing symptoms, even questioning traditional explanations. It wasn't science yet, but it was curiosity, and curiosity was the quiet engine of recovery. The human spirit, having survived near extinction, was restless. Explorers talked of sailing west toward new worlds, partly to find spices, partly to escape each other. Poets wrote about the brevity of life with an intensity only possible among people who'd seen it firsthand. The plague had been horror, yes, but also a reset button. It cleared space, brutally, for new ideas. And that's where we'll pause for tonight. If you were there, standing at the edge of the Renaissance, would you have felt hopeful or just tired? Leave a drowsy thought in the comments before you drift off. Let's float quietly into the next stretch soon, where Europe sails outward, discovers new lands, and brings along its usual baggage of pride, ignorance, and remarkably poor hygiene. By the middle of the 15th century, Europe had more priests per square mile than farmers. It wasn't that everyone had suddenly become holy. It was that so many families had lost heirs that the safest thing to do with a spare son was to park him in a monastery. There he could eat stale bread, avoid the plague, and ideally pray hard enough to protect whatever cousins remained. Naturally, this didn't make the monasteries spiritual powerhouses. It made them early retirement homes for terrified teenagers. Most of these boys weren't interested in theology. They wanted safety, or at least the illusion of it. And so monastic life became more about routine than revelation. Prayers were mumbled, ale was brewed, and someone inevitably started arguing over whose turn it was to dust the relics. If you've ever wondered how Europe ended up with 5 fingers of St. John the Baptist and 7 separate skulls of St. Valentine, well, this was the era that explained it. Pilgrimage returned with a vengeance. People walked for weeks to stare at bones in glass boxes, because bones, unlike kings, didn't raise taxes. Along the way, whole cottage industries sprang up, innkeepers selling holy water that looked suspiciously like rainwater, and merchants who could acquire you a genuine fragment of Noah's Ark for the price of a good chicken. Faith was the only currency left that everyone trusted, which meant everyone was counterfeiting it. And then there were the flagellants. Bands of men wandering from town to town, beating themselves with whips to atone for humanity's sins. They were like a traveling theater troupe, except their performance involved blood and self-loathing. Local priests hated them. Town children adored them, because who doesn't like a parade with drums and drama? The church tried to control this religious chaos by inventing rules faster than anyone could break them. Sumptuary laws dictated what colors people could wear, which fabrics were moral, which feasts were gluttonous. If you were poor, you were meant to look humble. If you were rich, you were meant to look like a tapestry had exploded on you. Naturally, everyone ignored both expectations. Somewhere between fasting and feasting, a subtle madness settled in. People dreamed of saints visiting them in the night, or of devils hiding in the neighbor's pig. And because there were still outbreaks, smaller, crueler reminders of the Black Death, these visions felt real enough to shape behavior. If a cow died suddenly, someone had whispered the wrong prayer. If a child survived, it was a miracle, which meant the parents owed the local church a new candle, or maybe 2. The irony, of course, is that the clergy who had survived the plague were the least qualified to interpret anything. The old, educated priests had died first. The replacements were whoever could read Latin without crying. So sermons became a mixture of superstition and self-help advice. Eat less meat, pray more, don't anger God, wash sometimes. Still, out of that fog came something unexpected: music. Monks with nothing better to do started experimenting with harmonies. Gregorian chants thickened, organs groaned, and slowly the sound of Europe began to change. It's a strange image. While half the continent was convinced the world might end again, the other half was inventing polyphony. If you'd been alive then, What would you have believed? Would you have trusted relics, or joined the flagellants, or stayed home brewing ale? Tell me in the comments, quietly, reverently. Let's drift onward. Once the church had regained its footing, it made the mistake of assuming the peasants would remain obedient. They did not. With land cheap and labor expensive, workers started asking impertinent questions like, "Why should I still be a serf?" It was a shocking development for landowners who had spent centuries perfecting the art of doing nothing. The peasant revolts that followed weren't organized revolutions so much as collective tantrums. In England, the 1381 revolt began because a tax collector tried to touch the wrong man's daughter. In France, the Jacquerie was named for Jacques, the peasant every noble imagined when complaining about the lower classes. Both were crushed brutally, of course, but something irreversible had shifted. For the first time, the masses realized the nobility could bleed, and rather easily. Life in villages slowly improved in small, unspectacular ways. People ate slightly more meat. Houses gained chimneys, which meant fewer families choking on their own hearth smoke. Clothing became brighter, thanks to dyes stolen from trade routes that no one had properly taxed yet. It wasn't prosperity, exactly, but it was a noticeable absence of misery, which, in medieval terms, counted as happiness. Meanwhile, the rich began reinventing themselves. Aristocrats discovered they could fund wars without fighting in them. Merchants realized they could buy titles if they contributed enough grain to starving cities. And thus, the early middle class crept into existence, quietly, like mold in damp bread. Guilds appeared to regulate crafts. Bakers swore solemn oaths about not shorting loaves, while blacksmiths argued about the proper number of nails in a horseshoe. It all sounds dull, and that's exactly what made it revolutionary. After a century of plagues and famines, dullness was precious. Of course, stability never lasts long in Europe. Enter the 100 Years' War, which lasted, as the name coyly suggests, longer than anyone had hoped. It began as a family dispute over the French throne and continued mostly because no one wanted to admit defeat. Armies marched, burned fields, and then retreated because of bad weather or worse accounting. Villages were destroyed, rebuilt, and destroyed again, sometimes by the same soldiers who had forgotten where they were last week. Yet out of this chaos came heroes with strangely fragile reputations. Joan of Arc, for instance, an illiterate peasant girl who heard voices, led armies, and was promptly executed by the people she had saved. Her story encapsulated the whole century: miraculous hope, followed by bureaucratic disaster. In quieter corners, culture hummed along. People began writing in their own languages rather than Latin. Chaucer mocked everyone equally in the Canterbury Tales. Boccaccio told stories so scandalous that priests pretended not to read them. Somewhere in all this chatter, Europe started discovering self-awareness, the first tiny flicker of what we'd later call modernity. But don't picture it as a grand awakening. It was more like a collective yawn after a long nightmare. People wanted comfort, not enlightenment. So they built taverns, brewed stronger beer, and invented gossip as a national pastime. Humanity, it turned out, survived the plague by talking endlessly about each other. Would you have joined the revolt, or just poured another cup of ale and watched. Whisper it below. I promise not to tell your landlord. Now, let's drift a little further into the 15th century. Part 9. The Renaissance. Accidentally. No one planned the Renaissance. It wasn't a memo that went out saying, "Let's rediscover antiquity." It was more of a slow realization that things had been grim for too long. When everyone has survived a century of death, war, and taxation, even marble statues start looking cheerful. Italy, naturally, went first. City-states like Florence and Venice had escaped the worst of the later plagues and were now drowning in money. Merchants wanted to appear cultured, and the cheapest way to do that was to hire artists who could paint them looking saintly. Thus began Europe's longest selfie phase. Patrons funded painters, painters flattered patrons, and before long the walls of every chapel were covered in pious billionaires pretending to pray. Perspective was rediscovered, anatomy was admired, and everyone suddenly cared about Plato again, though few actually read him. It was less a rebirth of learning and more a rebranding campaign. Humanism sounded noble, but it mostly meant, let's draw people who look less like potatoes. Meanwhile, science was sneaking back in, disguised as curiosity. Doctors started dissecting bodies, mostly stolen ones. Astronomers peered through primitive lenses and noticed that heaven didn't quite revolve as neatly as Scripture suggested. To avoid being burned, they called their findings thought experiments, which fooled no one but bought them a few extra years. Art and science grew together, awkwardly. Da Vinci sketched flying machines between commissions for angelic portraits. Brunelleschi built domes that defied both gravity and common sense. Even the popes couldn't resist, commissioning paintings of naked saints, then pretending to be shocked by them. Hypocrisy, as always, was the most renewable resource in Europe. But let's not romanticize it. While Florence glowed with frescoes, half of Germany was still arguing over whose goats belonged to which valley. The Renaissance was never a single event. It was a series of local oddities that later historians decided to connect. To most people alive then, it just meant better art in the churches and slightly worse taxes. Still, ideas began to travel faster. Paper replaced parchment. Books multiplied like rabbits, and literacy trickled downward, slowly, suspiciously. A literate peasant was a dangerous thing. He might realize the Bible didn't say anything about tithes being mandatory. By the end of the 15th century, Europe looked strangely modern. There were banks, accountants, art critics, and people arguing about copyright long before it existed. Kings now hired mathematicians instead of prophets, and merchants prayed to profit margins more faithfully than to saints. If the Black Death had wiped the slate clean, the Renaissance was humanity doodling in the margins again. Messy, ambitious, occasionally brilliant, and utterly human. Which brings us to a quiet irony. The world that rose from plague ashes wasn't pure or wise or even grateful. It was simply busy. Busy rebuilding, busy boasting, busy pretending that it had all been part of the plan. Would you have enjoyed that world of marble and merchants, or preferred the sleepy old villages with their gossip and goats? Let me know in the comments. Ideally before the next pandemic hits. Now let's drift toward the final chapters, where Europe learns to sail, to conquer, and to complain about it endlessly. By the late 15th century, Europe had grown restless again. The cities were crowded, the guilds were arguing, and the rich were running out of ways to look important. So naturally, attention turned outward. Maps were still more decorative than accurate, full of dragons and wishful thinking, but that didn't stop anyone. Exploration became fashionable, like a midlife crisis that affected entire nations. Portugal went first, sailing down the African coast in ships barely big enough to hold their optimism. They traded beads for gold, gold for spices, and spices for bragging rights. Then Spain joined in, loudly, because Spain never liked being left out of anything expensive. They sent Christopher Columbus west, mostly because they didn't quite understand where west led. And, against all odds, he found something. Not India, of course. Something else. Something inconveniently full of people. The age of discovery was, in many ways, the age of misunderstanding. Every explorer thought they'd reached somewhere else. Maps had to be redrawn every few months, which delighted cartographers but confused everyone else. And behind the polite language of trade was the growing reality of conquest. Europe's recovery from the Black Death had given it energy, money, and ships, and it used all three to find new ways of behaving badly abroad. The irony was almost poetic. A continent that had barely survived its own diseases began exporting them with enthusiasm. Sailors carried smallpox to new shores, returning home with silver, stories, and the occasional tropical parasite. Priests followed, clutching crosses and asking politely if anyone would like to be baptized before being colonized. Back home, people cheered. Exotic goods arrived: sugar, tobacco, cocoa. All the little comforts that would later ruin everyone's teeth and lungs. Europe's sweet tooth became its most profitable sin. Meanwhile, the peasants still couldn't afford bread, but they could smell the chocolate brewing in noble kitchens. It was a sensory reminder that someone, somewhere, was doing very well out of this new discovery business. And yet, not everything was greed. There was genuine wonder too. Letters describing parrots that talked, trees that bled sap like tears, and mountains taller than cathedrals. The world had suddenly become bigger again, and that realization was intoxicating. If you'd lived then, would you have boarded one of those ships? Or stayed home, watching the sails vanish into the horizon, wondering if they'd fall off the edge of the world? Whisper your answer quietly. It's a long voyage. Now let's drift on to what came next: printing, protest, and a very angry German monk. After a century of recovery, Europe found a new way to exhaust itself: religious debate. It began quietly, as all disasters do. A few scholars noticed that the church had become spectacularly wealthy again. They also noticed that forgiveness now came with a price tag. If you had enough coins, your sins could apparently vanish like magic. If you didn't, well, better luck in purgatory. Enter Martin Luther, a German monk with chronic anxiety and far too much time to read scripture. One day, he looked at the church's indulgence trade and said, more or less, absolutely not. Then he nailed a list of complaints to a church door, a bit like posting an angry blog before the internet existed. What followed was less a revolution than a decades-long family argument with printing presses involved. Printers, thrilled by the controversy, churned out pamphlets faster than anyone could ban them. Suddenly, theology became public entertainment. Ordinary people debated grace and salvation between pints of ale. The Reformation was noisy, messy, and, inevitably, political. Kings saw an opportunity. By siding with reformers, they could confiscate church lands and call it moral progress. Henry VIII did it most dramatically, divorcing his wife, inventing his own church, and marrying again before the ink dried. It was a scandal disguised as faith, which England accepted with weary amusement. For the average villager, little changed except the name on the church sign. Services were shorter, prayers were in the local language, and occasionally someone was burned at the stake for interpreting Scripture too enthusiastically. In short, religion became more personal, and therefore more dangerous. The printing press was the real miracle of the age. Ideas now traveled faster than armies. A tract written in Wittenberg could spark outrage in Paris within weeks. It was the medieval equivalent of going viral, except with fewer cats and more excommunication. And in all this noise, something subtle happened. People began to think of themselves as individuals. Not just souls in a collective church, but personal minds with personal beliefs. It was terrifying and liberating at once. The very thing that had once made Europe stable, shared faith, now became the source of endless division. Still, amid the chaos, literacy spread. A peasant who could read the Bible could also read about politics, and that idea was far more dangerous than heresy. Would you have sided with Luther, or kept your head down and avoided the flames? Tell me quietly, before someone reports you to the Inquisition. Now let's drift toward the final act, the New World, the old empires, and the tired sigh of a continent that had finally outgrown its medieval shell. By the 17th century, the Black Death was a memory, distant, yet strangely familiar. Epidemics still appeared now and then, like bad sequels, but Europe had learned how to live with uncertainty. Cities had walls, wells had regulations, and physicians carried canes topped with tiny skulls to look important. It wasn't exactly science, but it was progress of a sort. Life expectancy rose, though not by much. Wars came and went. The rich built elaborate gardens to remind themselves they could control at least the hedges, if not fate. And peasants, now calling themselves townsfolk or tradesmen, became the quiet backbone of an emerging middle class. The discovery of the Americas, the spread of trade, the rise of printing, and the fracturing of the church, all of it traced back, in some way, to that 14th century catastrophe. The plague had burned away the old order, leaving behind something both resilient and restless. It had taught Europe that survival wasn't guaranteed, that comfort was temporary, and that curiosity could be worth the risk. Art grew darker, philosophy deeper. Painters explored light and shadow not just for beauty, but to ask whether either could exist alone. Writers pondered destiny. Scientists measured the stars, as if trying to prove that the universe wasn't simply a punishment waiting to happen. And through it all, the hum of ordinary life persisted. The same market cries, the same laughter in taverns, the same quiet hope that tomorrow might be better, or at least tolerable. Human beings had found a rhythm again, and it sounded almost like peace. If you were to walk through a 17th century street, you'd still see fear in people's eyes when illness struck. But you'd also see resilience, the kind born from generations who knew exactly how bad things could get and chose to keep living anyway. Maybe that's the real legacy of the Black Death. Not the bones in the ground, but the stubborn heartbeat above it. The world that emerged wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was undeniably human, curious, flawed, and endlessly determined to make sense of its own survival. And now, as we lie here centuries later, breathing quietly under our own fragile roofs, maybe we're not so different. We still chase comfort, argue about faith, and search for meaning in the ruins of yesterday. The only real progress is that our candles are electric, and our prayers go by Wi-Fi. So, if you've drifted this far with me, thank you. You've traveled across 300 years without leaving your pillow. If you're still awake, I'd love to know. What moment would you have chosen to live in? The rebuilding after the plague, the riot of the Renaissance, or the quiet dawn of science? Tell me softly in the comments below. And if your eyes are already heavy, that's perfectly fine. Let the world fade. Let the centuries blur. You've earned your rest. Until next time, sleep well, dream historically, and if you enjoyed this long drift through time, do the gentle things. Like the video if it calmed you. Share it with someone who loves slow stories. And subscribe for more quiet wanderings through history's half-lit corners. Good night.